Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where history exhales slowly, like a ghost that never learned to leave. You didn't just smother the Archbishop, you welcomed him home, handed him the candle, and shut the door behind the swords. Thank you for letting these stories lull you into the dark. If they've helped you drift off, gently press like, subscribe, or whisper in the comments where you're watching from and what time sleep usually finds you. Tonight, you excommunicate your enemies with a smile, polish the papal seal, and wait for the thunder. You write their damnation in Latin and fall asleep before the ink dries. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of your limbs sink slowly into the mattress. Let your breath soften as the edge of the day fades to murmur. You're safe now, warm beneath sheets that hold the last of the candle's glow, your mind rocking gently between the waking world and what waits below it. Now the floor beneath you shifts, cold stone cloisters underfoot, the scent of wax and iron, robes brushing against old flags, a hush before the procession. Someone lights a candle. The door creaks open, and far away, in a kingdom lit by thunder, 4 knights ride through the fog with no orders, and no plans to wait for morning. Thomas Becket's return to Canterbury on December 4th, 1170 had all the festive atmosphere of a funeral where the corpse kept making pronouncements. After 6 years of exile, England's most troublesome archbishop was back, and he'd brought souvenirs, not the pleasant kind involving local crafts or wine, but papal letters with the destructive potential of Greek fire and considerably less charm. The crowds that greeted him at Sandwich and along the road to Canterbury treated him like a combination of returning hero and travelling saint. They knelt in the December mud, sought his blessing, and generally behaved as if exile had transformed him from difficult ecclesiastic to divine instrument. Thomas, never one to waste good theatre, blessed them with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been storing up benedictions for 6 years and was eager to spend them. But beneath the pageantry was purpose, sharp as the winter wind. Those carefully packed papal letters weren't diplomatic niceties. They were weapons, preloaded and aimed at specific targets. Thomas had spent 6 years in exile thinking about this moment, and he'd decided that reconciliation was for people who lacked imagination. He had something better in mind, vindication through devastation. The first sign of trouble came before he'd even reached Canterbury. At his manor of Tainham, he paused to deal with urgent business, not the kind involving property disputes or administrative matters, but the kind that involved destroying his enemies with precision-guided excommunications. The papal letters were unpacked with the care of an armourer preparing for battle. The 3 bishops who had participated in the coronation of the young King Henry were about to discover that Thomas had a long memory and access to papal stationery. Roger of York, who had performed the ceremony that rightfully belonged to Canterbury, was first on the list. Gilbert Folliot of London and Jocelyn de Bourn of Salisbury, who had assisted, were next. Each had committed the unforgivable sin of acting as if the Archbishop of Canterbury didn't exist. Thomas was about to remind them, forcefully, that he did. The excommunications were delivered with timing that suggested either divine inspiration or very careful planning. Thomas didn't wait to reach Canterbury, didn't call for negotiations, didn't even pretend to consider reconciliation. He struck immediately, like someone who'd been planning this moment for years, which he had. The letters were dispatched with the efficiency of a man who understood that surprise was half of victory. The wording of the excommunications was vintage Thomas, legally precise, theologically comprehensive, and personally vindictive. Each bishop was not merely excommunicated, but thoroughly excommunicated, their sins catalogued with the kind of detail that suggested Thomas had been keeping very careful notes during his exile. They weren't just cut off from the church, they were cut off with footnotes. Roger of York received special attention. His excommunication letter was a masterpiece of controlled fury wrapped in ecclesiastical legalese. Not only had he usurped Canterbury's prerogative, but he'd done so knowingly, willingly, and with what Thomas characterised as malicious joy. The fact that Roger had been following royal orders was deemed irrelevant. In the cosmic hierarchy that Thomas recognised, papal authority trumped royal command, and Canterbury's privileges trumped everything. The reaction was immediate and predictable. The excommunicated bishops, who had probably expected some form of negotiation, or at least the courtesy of a warning, found themselves spiritually severed from the church with the suddenness of winter frost. They had prepared for Thomas's return, but not for this. Not for immediate, irrevocable spiritual warfare conducted through papal mail. Their options were limited and universally bad. They could appeal to Thomas, who had just demonstrated his flexibility by attacking them before his luggage was fully unpacked. They could appeal to the Pope, who had provided Thomas with the ammunition in the first place. Or they could appeal to Henry, who was in Normandy and probably wouldn't appreciate hearing that his archbishop had returned and immediately started excommunicating people. They chose Henry because at least his anger was predictable and earthly. Spiritual damnation was theoretical. Royal displeasure was immediate and came with practical consequences like property seizure and exile. The three bishops prepared for a channel crossing with the enthusiasm of men heading to their own execution, which, given Henry's temper, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Meanwhile, Thomas continued to Canterbury as if he hadn't just declared war on a significant portion of the English episcopacy. He entered his cathedral city on December 2 with all the ceremony his position demanded, and none of the humility his situation suggested. The crowds were larger here, the enthusiasm more intense. Thomas Becket was home, and he was making sure everyone knew it. His installation back into the routines of Canterbury was swift but pointed. Every gesture was calculated to demonstrate that he was not returning as a penitent, but as a victor. He celebrated Mass with particular emphasis on readings about spiritual authority. He blessed with the kind of intensity that suggested blessings were weapons. He preached with the subtlety of someone who'd forgotten what subtlety meant. The sermon he delivered on December 3 was a masterwork of passive-aggressive spirituality. He spoke of forgiveness while listing grievances. He preached reconciliation while identifying enemies. He called for peace while sharpening swords. The congregation, used to more conventional homilies, listened with the fascination of people watching a very holy train wreck in slow motion. But it was in private that Thomas revealed the full extent of his intentions. To his inner circle he spoke not of peace, but of purification. The English church had been corrupted by royal interference. Bishops had forgotten their spiritual obligations. The rights of Canterbury had been trampled. All of this would be corrected, and Thomas had the papal authority to correct it. His list of targets extended beyond the three already excommunicated bishops. Anyone who had profited from his exile, anyone who had supported the constitutions of Clarendon, anyone who had failed to defend ecclesiastical privilege, all were potential recipients of Thomas's spiritual justice. He had returned not to govern, but to judge, and his judgments were harsh. The monks of Canterbury watched their returning archbishop with mixed emotions. Joy at his return was tempered by alarm at his methods. They had maintained the cathedral and its properties during his absence, navigating the difficult waters between royal pressure and ecclesiastical duty. Now Thomas was back, steering directly into the storm with what seemed like enthusiastic determination. Some tried to counsel moderation. Prior Odo, who had managed Canterbury's affairs during the exile, suggested that perhaps immediate excommunications weren't the best way to ensure a peaceful return. Thomas listened with the patience of someone who had no intention of taking advice, and responded with canon law citations that proved excommunication was not only justified, but required. The younger monks were more enthusiastic. 6 years of stories about their archbishop's exile had transformed Thomas from administrator to hero. His immediate attack on his enemies confirmed their image of him as God's warrior, fighting spiritual battles with documentary weapons. They saw not recklessness, but righteousness, not provocation, but justice. As December 3 turned to December 4, the pattern was established. Thomas was back, but he hadn't returned to the status quo ante. He had returned to fight, to vindicate, to demonstrate that 6 years of exile had only hardened his resolve. The papal letters were his ammunition, excommunication his weapon, and he was using both with the precision of someone who'd had 6 years to plan his targets. The weather, as if providing atmospheric commentary, was bitter. December frost made the stones of Canterbury treacherous. Wind whistled through the cathedral with the kind of cold that suggested nature itself was taking sides. Thomas, wrapped in his righteousness and probably several layers of wool, seemed immune to both weather and warnings. Messages flew from Canterbury like very angry birds. Some went to Rome, reporting Thomas's successful return and immediate actions. Others went to supporters throughout England, announcing that their archbishop was back and actively defending their interests. But the most important messages were heading across the Channel, carried by 3 excommunicated bishops who needed to explain to an already irritable king that his biggest problem had just gotten bigger. Thomas, settling into his archiepiscopal palace with the satisfaction of someone exactly where they wanted to be, began planning his next moves. The excommunications had been just the opening salvo. He had 6 years of grievances to address, 6 years of injustices to correct, 6 years of royal interference to reverse. The papal letters gave him the authority, his own determination provided the will. As night fell, on December 4, 1170, Thomas Becket was fully restored to Canterbury. But this wasn't the restoration Henry had envisioned at Predictably. This was restoration with revenge, reconciliation with retribution. The archbishop who had left in fear and darkness had returned in power and light, and he was using both to blind his enemies. The shadows of exile had followed him home, but now they were weapons rather than refuges. In 3 days, Thomas had shattered whatever fragile peace his return was supposed to create. He had chosen confrontation over compromise, judgment over mercy. And somewhere across the Channel, a king was about to learn that bringing Thomas home had been easier than controlling him once he got there. The 3 excommunicated bishops, Roger of York, Gilbert Folio of London, and Jocelyn de Beauron of Salisbury, received their spiritual death sentences with all the dignified composure of men discovering wasps in their undergarments. The parchments arrived, sealed with papal authority, and delivered with archiepiscopal glee, transforming a December morning into a theological emergency that required immediate and panicked action. Roger of York, who held himself as the second most important churchman in England, found himself suddenly cut off from the church he supposedly helped lead. The excommunication letter, which he read with increasing disbelief and decreasing colour in his face, detailed his crimes with the thoroughness of someone who'd been maintaining a grudge journal. Performing the coronation had been bad enough. Enjoying it, as Thomas's letter suggested he had, was apparently worse. The practical implications were immediate and terrifying. An excommunicated bishop couldn't perform sacraments, couldn't enter churches, couldn't do any of the things that justified the rather comfortable lifestyle to which he'd become accustomed. He was spiritually radioactive, and in an age when spiritual contamination was taken seriously, this was career-ending. Possibly life-ending if one believed in the eternal consequences which Roger suddenly found himself very much believing in. Gilbert Folliot of London, Thomas's oldest and most consistent enemy, received his excommunication with the bitter recognition of someone who'd seen this coming but hoped to avoid it anyway. He and Thomas had been rivals since their days as bright young clerks, and exile hadn't softened their mutual antipathy. If anything, it had aged it into something more potent, like wine becoming vinegar. Gilbert's excommunication letter was a particular masterpiece of vindictive precision. Thomas hadn't just excommunicated him for participating in the coronation, he'd included a comprehensive list of Gilbert's failures dating back years. It was less a spiritual censure and more a performance review written by someone who'd been storing up criticisms and finally had the authority to deliver them. Jocelyn de Beauron of Salisbury, the youngest and least politically astute of the 3, read his excommunication with the dawning horror of someone realizing they'd picked the wrong side in a theological civil war. He had participated in the coronation more from peer pressure than conviction, and now he was grouped with the primary offenders, spiritually severed with the same decisive stroke. The 3 bishops convened in emergency session, meeting with the furtive urgency of conspirators, even though their conspiracy had already failed. The question wasn't whether to appeal to the king, that was obvious, but how to present their case in a way that wouldn't result in their temporal destruction following their spiritual one. Henry's temper was legendary, and bearing bad news to him required careful planning and possibly armour. They decided to travel together, partly for mutual support and partly because misery loves company, especially when crossing the winter channel. Their preparations were hasty but thorough. Documents were gathered proving their loyalty to the crown. Arguments were rehearsed, explaining why their excommunications were both illegal and personally insulting to royal dignity. Warm clothes were packed because December channel crossings were nature's way of adding physical misery to spiritual distress. The journey to the coast was a medieval road trip of escalating panic. At every stop they refined their arguments, practiced their presentations, and generally worked themselves into states of anxiety that would have impressed modern therapists. They were three of the most powerful men in England, reduced to rehearsing speeches like students preparing for particularly difficult examinations. The Channel crossing was, predictably, horrible. December seas had all the stability of Henry's moods and considerably less warmth. The bishops, already queasy with anxiety, spent the voyage in various states of physical and spiritual distress. Roger of York, maintaining what dignity he could while vomiting over the side, probably reflected that this was exactly the kind of suffering Thomas would enjoy hearing about. They landed in Normandy looking like men who'd been through both physical and metaphysical storms. Their appearance at Henry's court was dramatic in all the wrong ways. Three of England's senior bishops, excommunicated, exhausted, and reeking of sea spray and desperation, throwing themselves on royal mercy with the kind of theatrical self-abasement that medieval courts excelled at. Henry received them in his great hall at Berlerich, with the expression of a man who'd been expecting bad news, but not quite this much of it. The bishop's story tumbled out in a mixture of legal argument, personal grievance, and barely controlled panic. Thomas hadn't just returned, he'd returned armed with papal weapons. He hadn't sought reconciliation, he'd launched immediate attack. He wasn't acting like a restored archbishop. He was acting like an avenging angel with a very specific list of targets. The king's court, always alert to royal moods, watched Henry's face darken like storm clouds gathering over unfortunate landscapes. The bishops continued their catalogue of woes, each addition making the situation worse. Not only had Thomas excommunicated them, but he'd done so publicly, with apparent joy, and with papal letters that made appeal difficult. It wasn't just personal revenge, it was institutionalized humiliation. Henry's response was initially measured, which for Henry meant he only broke furniture in his mind. He questioned the bishops closely, establishing timelines, confirming details, building a picture of calculated defiance that made his jaw clench and his courtiers step back. Thomas hadn't even waited to reach Canterbury. He'd struck while still on the road, like a man so eager for revenge he couldn't delay it for comfort. The legal arguments the bishops presented were sound, but irrelevant. Yes, they had acted on royal orders. Yes, the coronation had been necessary. Yes, they had technical justifications for their actions. But none of that mattered if the Pope supported Thomas, which apparently he did, with sealed letters to prove it. They were playing local law against universal authority, and universal authority had better documentation. As the bishops continued their presentation, Henry's court began its familiar dance of distancing. Courtiers found urgent business elsewhere. Minor nobles remembered appointments. Even the guards seemed to stand a little further from the royal presence. Everyone recognized the signs of an impending Henrician explosion, and nobody wanted to be in the splash zone. The bishops, too deep in their own panic to notice the evacuation happening around them, continued building their case. They spoke of loyalty unrewarded, of service unrecognized, of an archbishop who'd forgotten his place and needed reminding. They were saying everything Henry wanted to hear, which made it worse because it confirmed what he already knew. Thomas Becket was beyond control, beyond reason, and beyond the reach of normal political management. The explosion, when it came, was vintage Henry. Loud, creative, and featuring language that would have made sailors blush if sailors hadn't already learnt most of it from him. The king raged about ungrateful priests, treacherous friends, and the general inadequacy of everyone who was supposed to prevent situations like this. The bishops weathered the storm with the patience of men who knew they'd caused it, but had no choice. But it was after the rage subsided that the real problem became clear. Henry couldn't simply reverse the excommunications. They came with papal authority, and even kings had to respect that, or at least appear to. He couldn't arrest Thomas without causing a crisis that would make the current one look manageable. He couldn't ignore the situation because excommunicated bishops were administratively useless and politically embarrassing. The bishops, sensing a shift from rage to calculation, pressed their advantage. They spoke of the broader implications, of how Thomas's actions challenged not just them, but royal authority itself. Every excommunication was a declaration that spiritual power superseded temporal authority. Every papal letter was a reminder that England's church wasn't entirely England's. They were painting a picture of systematic challenge to royal supremacy, and Henry was listening. As the interview concluded, the bishops were dismissed with vague promises of royal action. They retired to whatever accommodations excommunicated bishops could find, probably wondering if they should have chosen different careers. Henry remained in his hall, surrounded by the debris of his rage and the larger wreckage of his relationship with Thomas Becket. The news spread through the court with the speed of scandal. The Archbishop of Canterbury had returned and immediately attacked 3 bishops. He had papal support and no apparent interest in compromise. The careful non-reconciliation of Fréteval had lasted exactly as long as it took Thomas to unpack his papal letters. War had been declared, and Henry hadn't even known he was fighting until the first casualties reported in. At night, as December cold settled over Normandy, 3 excommunicated bishops prayed for royal intervention while carefully avoiding actual churches. They had played their part, delivered their message, and triggered whatever response Henry would make. Their panic had been predictable, their journey necessary, their reception explosive. Now all they could do was wait, and hope that temporal power could somehow overcome spiritual censure. The shadows were lengthening, and not just from the winter sun. The crisis that had seemed resolved was resurging with renewed violence. Thomas Becket hadn't returned to England to make peace, he'd returned to finish what he'd started 6 years earlier. And somewhere in the royal chambers, Henry II was learning that bringing his turbulent priest home had been the easy part. The Norman December of 1170 was the kind that made wine freeze in goblets and tempers freeze in that dangerous state just before explosion. Henry II's court at Ber-le-Roi had taken on the atmosphere of a castle under siege, except the enemy was news from England, and the weapons were increasingly frantic messages about Archbishop Thomas Becket's spectacular return to form. The weather matched the mood with oppressive perfection. Rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be sleet hammered against windows with the persistence of creditors. Wind howled through every gap in the masonry, like it was auditioning for a Greek chorus. The great halls, usually warmed by the press of courtiers and the heat of political intrigue, felt cold, despite the fires that consumed entire trees. Henry's mood darkened with each arriving messenger. The initial reports of Thomas's excommunications had been bad enough. The follow-up intelligence was worse. Thomas wasn't stopping with the 3 bishops. He was threatening interdicts, preparing more excommunications, and generally acting like a man who'd confused his return from exile with the Second Coming, with himself in the starring role. The king's routine, usually a whirlwind of administrative efficiency and territorial management, ground to a halt. Henry, who normally could juggle the governance of an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, while simultaneously planning 3 wars and a cathedral, found himself fixated on one turbulent priest, who seemed determined to unravel everything through sheer bloody-mindedness. Courtiers, who'd served Henry for years, recognized the signs. The king wasn't just angry, he was approaching that special state of Angevin rage that had its own weather system. He paced with the mechanical intensity of a siege engine winding up. He muttered in multiple languages, none of them complimentary to Thomas. He gripped wine goblets with enough force to leave fingerprints in the metal. The business of ruling continued around him like water flowing around a very angry rock. Chancellors presented documents that Henry signed without reading, treasurers reported figures that Henry acknowledged without hearing, military commanders outlined campaigns that Henry approved without caring. His entire considerable intelligence was focused on the problem of Thomas Becket, with the kind of concentration that could bore holes in stone. What made it worse was the personal betrayal that flavoured every report. This wasn't just any archbishop defying royal authority. This was Thomas. His Thomas. The man he'd raised from competent clerk to chancellor, from chancellor to archbishop. Every excommunication felt personal, because it was personal. Every defiant act was a reminder that Henry's greatest political miscalculation was trusting a friend. The court, meanwhile, had developed the survival instincts of small animals in the presence of predators. Conversations were conducted in whispers. Laughter was extinct. Even routine court functions were performed with the kind of careful quiet that suggested everyone was trying to avoid attracting notice. It was like living in a castle, where the dragon was in residence rather than being slain. Henry's inner circle of advisors faced an impossible task. They needed to calm the king without appearing to defend Thomas, suggest solutions without seeming weak, and generally navigate between Scylla and Charybdis while both were having bad days. Most chose the safest path, agreeing with whatever Henry said while mentally composing their wills. The December 25th Christmas court, usually a celebration combining religious observance with political networking, was approaching with all the festive promise of a funeral. Preparations continued because they had to, but everyone knew this would be a Christmas remembered for all the wrong reasons. The cooks prepared feasts with the enthusiasm of people cooking for their own wakes. The musicians practiced with the joy of those preparing dirges. It was in this atmosphere of meteorological and psychological oppression that Henry's control finally snapped. The exact moment was recorded differently by different chroniclers, probably because everyone was trying to be somewhere else when it happened. What they agreed on was that the king's rage finally found verbal expression in a way that would echo through history. The famous words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" may or may not have been exactly what Henry said. Medieval chroniclers had a tendency to improve quotes for dramatic effect. What seems certain is that Henry expressed, loudly and creatively, his frustration that Thomas Becket continued to exist in defiance of royal preference and common sense. The outburst itself was probably more elaborate and definitely more profane than history records. Henry had a gift for creative invective that could strip paint from walls and dignity from listeners. He likely covered Thomas's ancestry, his character, his appearance, his motivations, and his probable eternal destination with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he'd been composing this speech for years. But it was the question, however it was actually phrased, that mattered. In the heated atmosphere of the court, with the king's rage at its peak and his control at its nadir, asking whether anyone would rid him of Thomas wasn't rhetorical. It was the kind of question that ambitious knights with flexible morals and sharp swords were likely to take literally. The court's reaction to the royal explosion was predictable. Those who could fled. Those who couldn't tried to become invisible. The silence that followed Henry's rage was the kind that suggested everyone was simultaneously holding their breath and reviewing their career options. Even the fires seemed to burn more quietly, as if afraid of attracting attention. Henry himself, spent by his outburst, probably didn't immediately realize what he'd done. In his mind, he'd simply expressed frustration with characteristic violence. He hadn't issued orders or made plans, he'd just shouted into the void. And if the void happened to be full of armed men with a keen interest in royal favour, that was hardly his fault. But medieval courts were echo chambers where even whispers could become shouts. Henry's words, whatever their exact form, rippled through the assembled knights and nobles like stones thrown into still water. Most heard them as the king venting his frustration, some heard them as interesting political intelligence, but a few heard them as something else entirely: opportunity. As December 25 approached, the court prepared for a Christmas that would be remembered for atmospheric pressure rather than spiritual celebration. The weather continued its assault on Norman architecture. The king's mood remained volcanic with periodic eruptions, and somewhere in the crowd of courtiers, knights and hangers-on, 4 men were having a very quiet conversation about what exactly their king had meant and what exactly they might do about it. The ugliness wasn't just in the weather anymore. It had infected the court, the political situation, and the relationships that held medieval society together. Henry's rage had transformed from personal frustration to political crisis. The question he'd shouted in anger was about to receive an answer he hadn't expected, from men who understood loyalty in the simple terms of solving their king's problems with direct action. The 4 knights who would transform Henry's frustrated rhetoric into brutal reality were, by the standards of their time, relatively unremarkable. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton were the kind of men who filled medieval courts, competent in violence, ambitious for advancement, and possessed of that particular moral flexibility that allowed them to see opportunity where others saw outrage. They had heard Henry's explosive question not as the rhetorical device it probably was, but as the kind of coded message that medieval politics often employed. When kings asked whether anyone would rid them of problems, it was usually understood that volunteers would be appreciated, even if they couldn't be officially acknowledged. It was plausible deniability with chainmail. The four knights found each other in the aftermath of Henry's outburst with the instinct of men who recognized shared thinking. They didn't need to debate whether the king had meant what he said. They only needed to decide whether acting on it would bring reward or ruin. Medieval career advancement often depended on reading between the lines of royal frustration, and these lines seemed particularly clear. Their planning, such as it was, took place in corners and shadows. This wasn't a mission that could be discussed openly or documented properly. There would be no royal writs, no official sanctions, no written orders. Just four men with swords and a shared understanding that Thomas Becket was a problem their king wanted solved, preferably permanently. The decision to act was probably easier than it should have been. These were men raised in violence, trained for war, accustomed to solving disputes with steel rather than scripture. The idea of killing an archbishop should have been unthinkable, but Thomas had excommunicated bishops and defied kings. In their simple warrior logic, he had placed himself outside normal protections. They left Henry's court quietly, without fanfare or farewell. Four knights departing wasn't unusual enough to attract notice, especially during the chaos of Christmas preparations. They probably told anyone who asked that they had urgent business in England, which was technically true if you defined business broadly enough to include murder. Their lack of official authority didn't trouble them. Medieval knights were used to operating on implied permission and retrospective justification. If they succeeded in removing Henry's troublesome priest, the king's gratitude would legitimize their actions. If they failed, they could claim misunderstanding or excessive zeal. It was a calculated risk, but these were men who calculated in simple terms. The journey to the coast was conducted with the urgency of men who understood that second thoughts were dangerous and delays fatal. They travelled hard, changing horses when necessary, avoiding lengthy stops that might allow conscience or common sense to interfere. They were on a mission that made sense only if you didn't think about it too carefully, so they carefully didn't think. At the Channel ports they separated briefly to avoid attracting attention. Four armed knights travelling together in obvious haste might raise questions, and questions were what they couldn't afford. They took different ships, maintained different cover stories, but kept the same destination and purpose. The Channel crossing, rough with winter storms, gave them time to refine their plan, such as it was. The plan itself was more intention than strategy. Find Thomas, confront him, force him to submit to royal will. If he refused, and they probably hoped he would refuse, then more direct measures would be necessary. It was the kind of plan that worked best if you didn't examine the details, like what exactly constituted submission, or how exactly one forced an archbishop to do anything. They regrouped in England with the efficiency of men who'd done this sort of thing before, though probably not to archbishops. Their equipment was standard for the time: swords, mail, the usual implements of medieval argument, resolution. They didn't bring special weapons or elaborate tools. This was to be straightforward work, if killing an archbishop in his own cathedral could ever be called straightforward. The journey to Canterbury was swift but not subtle. Four armed knights travelling with purpose were hard to hide, and they didn't particularly try. There was something almost arrogant about their approach, as if they were so confident in their interpretation of royal will that concealment was unnecessary. They were Henry's men on Henry's business, even if Henry didn't know it yet. Along the way, they gathered intelligence with the casual efficiency of experienced soldiers. Thomas was at Canterbury, apparently continuing his campaign of excommunications and provocations. He hadn't increased his security or shown any awareness of specific threats. He was in fact behaving exactly like a man who believed his spiritual authority made him untouchable. The knights were about to test that belief. Their mood during the journey was probably a mixture of determination and anticipation. These were men who solved problems directly, and Thomas Becket was a problem that had persisted too long. Every mile brought them closer to resolution. Every hour hardened their resolve. They were past the point of questioning their mission. Now they were simply implementing it. The December weather that had made Normandy miserable was equally unkind to England. They rode through frost and sleet, through mud that grabbed at horses' hooves and cold that bit through mail. But discomfort was nothing new to medieval knights, and if anything, the harsh conditions reinforced their sense of purpose. This was hard work undertaken for their king, even if their king hadn't explicitly asked for it. As they approached Canterbury on December 28, they made no effort at subtlety. They stopped at Saltwood Castle, held by Ranulph de Broc, one of Thomas's enemies. Here they could rest, plan, and gather final intelligence. De Broc, who had his own grievances against the Archbishop, was probably happy to assist, though he was careful not to know too much about their exact intentions. The final approach to Canterbury was almost anticlimactic. No divine intervention prevented them. No royal messengers arrived with last-minute reprieves. The weather didn't improve to suggest heavenly disapproval. Just 4 knights riding toward a cathedral town with the simple intention of solving a political problem through direct action. They arrived at Canterbury on December 29, still without official authority but with unshaken conviction. The town was busy with its usual activities, unaware that historical infamy was riding through its gates. The knights found lodgings, stabled their horses, and prepared for what they probably thought would be a straightforward confrontation. Their interpretation of Henry's words had carried them from Normandy to Canterbury, from frustrated rhetoric to planned action. Whether they were right or wrong in that interpretation would be debated for centuries. What mattered in the moment was that they believed they were right, and they had the swords to act on that belief. Tomorrow they would confront Thomas Becket. They would demand his submission to royal will, and when he inevitably refused, because Thomas Becket refusing was as certain as winter cold, they would do what they'd come to do. It was simple, direct, and utterly catastrophic in its implications, but medieval knights weren't hired for their consideration of long-term consequences. While 4 knights settled into Canterbury with the grim patience of men preparing for distasteful but necessary work, Thomas Becket continued his archiepiscopal duties with either sublime ignorance of danger or sublime indifference to it. December 28, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, found him conducting services with particular emphasis on martyrdom, which in retrospect seems either prescient or provocative. The atmosphere in Canterbury Cathedral was electric, with the kind of tension that precedes thunderstorms or catastrophes. Thomas's household, more politically astute than their master, or simply more attached to continuing breathing, had noticed the arrival of armed strangers. Whispers of Norman knights with uncertain business circulated through the cathedral precincts like incense smoke, but darker and more ominous. Thomas himself seemed energized rather than alarmed by the growing tension. His sermon on December 28 was a masterpiece of aggressive spirituality, comparing the sufferings of the Holy Innocents to the sufferings of the English Church under royal oppression. The congregation, used to more conventional homilies, listened with the fascination of people watching someone juggle fire in a gunpowder store. His routine continued with mechanical precision. Morning prayers, administrative duties, correspondence that continued his campaign of ecclesiastical warfare. He dictated letters with the same certainty that had characterized his exile, as if 6 years of failure to achieve his goals had only reinforced his conviction that he was right. Each letter was another small act of defiance, another assertion that spiritual authority superseded temporal power. The monks of Canterbury watched their archbishop with growing alarm. Some tried to suggest that perhaps a lower profile might be wise given the circumstances. Thomas responded with canon law and theological certainty. Others hinted that the arrival of Norman knights might warrant precautions. Thomas replied with scripture about shepherds who didn't flee from wolves. It was magnificent, principled, and utterly impractical. Edward Grimm, a visiting clerk who would soon become an eyewitness to history, later described Thomas's demeanour as tranquil as a man who had already conquered the world. This tranquility might have been spiritual achievement, or simple stubbornness elevated to theological principle. Either way, it was about to be severely tested. Messages arrived throughout December 28 warning of danger. Local supporters reported the knight's presence and probable intentions. Friendly nobles suggested that perhaps a strategic withdrawal might be prudent. Even some of his enemies, apparently preferring a live opponent to a dead martyr, sent hints that December 29 might be an excellent day to be elsewhere. Thomas ignored them all, with the serene certainty of someone who decided that being right was more important than being alive. The knights, meanwhile, spent December 28 in final preparations. They attended to their equipment with the methodical care of professionals. Swords were sharpened, mail was checked, plans were refined. They probably attended Mass, because medieval logic saw no contradiction between preparing for murder and maintaining religious observances. God, in their view, would understand that they were serving their earthly king. Their plan had evolved from vague intention to specific action. They would confront Thomas publicly, demand his submission to royal authority, and when he refused, as he certainly would, they would have justification for whatever followed. It was the kind of plan that made perfect sense if you were a medieval knight, and no sense at all if you were anyone else. The evening of December 28 saw unusual activity around the cathedral. Thomas's supporters, finally convincing him that some precautions might be wise, increased the guard and checked the locks. It was a futile gesture. 4 determined knights weren't going to be stopped by medieval security, but it made everyone feel like they were doing something. Thomas himself spent the evening in prayer and correspondence. His last letters showed no awareness of specific danger, just the same themes he'd pursued for 6 years: the independence of the church, the wickedness of royal interference, the righteousness of his cause. He was a man writing his principles in stone, unaware that stones were about to become irrelevant. The night passed quietly, which, in medieval narratives, usually means ominously. The knights slept the sleep of men with clear consciences, or no consciences at all. Thomas probably slept poorly, though whether from premonition or just the December cold in a medieval bedroom is unknown. The monks kept vigil, praying for peace while preparing for something worse. December 29 dawned grey and bitter, the kind of morning that suggested God was in a mood. Thomas rose for prime with his usual punctuality, celebrating the morning office as if it were any other day. His sermon touched on themes of sacrifice and duty, words that would echo differently in retrospect. The congregation, swollen with curious locals who'd heard rumours, listened with unusual attention. After the morning services, Thomas retired to his chambers for the administrative work that even impending doom couldn't postpone. He reviewed accounts, settled disputes, and generally demonstrated that being Archbishop of Canterbury involved more paperwork than anyone expected. It was mundane work performed under extraordinary circumstances, like updating spreadsheets during an earthquake. The knights made their move after dinner, that medieval meal taken around midday. They arrived at the Archbishop's palace not as assassins but as royal officers demanding audience. They'd decided to give Thomas one last chance to submit, though they probably hoped he wouldn't take it. Martyrs were made by defiance, and Thomas had never disappointed when defiance was required. The first confrontation was almost civilized. The knights were admitted to Thomas's chamber, where they found him surrounded by clerks and conducting business. They stated their demands. Thomas must absolve the excommunicated bishops, submit to royal authority, and generally stop being so troublesome. It was a familiar list, presented with military directness. Thomas's response was predictably uncompromising. He would not absolve bishops who had violated church law. He would not submit to authority that contradicted divine will. He would not, in short, do anything the knights demanded. It was the response they'd expected and probably wanted. Negotiations were over before they began. The confrontation escalated quickly. Voices raised, threats were made, hands moved to sword hilts. Thomas's clerks tried to intervene, to moderate, to prevent the inevitable. But momentum had been building for 6 years, and 4 knights with sharp swords were unlikely to be stopped by sharp words. The knights withdrew, but only to arm themselves fully. The pretense of negotiation was over. When they returned, it would be as executioners rather than envoys. Thomas's household, finally understanding that this was not another theological debate but a mortal threat, tried to convince their archbishop to flee, or at least take sanctuary in the cathedral. Thomas's response was characteristic. He would not flee like a coward. He would not hide from men doing Satan's work. He would meet whatever came with the dignity of his office and the certainty of his cause. It was magnificent, infuriating, and about to be fatal. The storm had been gathering for 6 years. Now it was about to break, and Thomas Becket stood directly in its path, arms spread wide, daring lightning to strike. The final movements began with the deliberate pace of tragedy accepting its cue. The 4 knights, Fitzurse, de Morville, de Tracy, and Le Breton, returned from the Archbishop's palace to complete their grim business. They had given Thomas his chance to submit. he had given them his refusal. Now came the part where words ended and swords began their own eloquent argument. But even now, at the last moment, there was almost comedy in the confusion. Thomas's monks, displaying more survival instinct than their master, had barred the palace doors. The knights found themselves locked out, reduced to shouting threats and demands, while Thomas continued his business inside. It was an awkward pause in what should have been a smooth progression to violence. The solution was typically medieval. If you can't go through doors, go around them. The knights found another entrance, probably with local assistance from those who preferred their archbishops less turbulent. Meanwhile, Thomas's household engaged in the frantic activity of people trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. They convinced Thomas to move to the cathedral, not because he agreed about the danger, but because it was time for Vespers. And Thomas was punctual about his offices, even when facing death. The procession from palace to cathedral was hurried, but still maintained some dignity. Thomas refused to run, refused to show fear, refused to act like anything other than an archbishop going about his duties. The cathedral bells were already ringing for Vespers when Thomas entered through the cloister. The monks, sensing something beyond the ordinary, had begun to bar the cathedral doors. Thomas, in what would be his last act of defiant principle, ordered them opened. A church was not a fortress. The house of God should not be barricaded against anyone, even murderous knights. It was theologically sound and practically suicidal. The knights entered the cathedral with the confidence of men who'd passed the point of return. They were armed, angry, and animated by the simple certainty that they were solving their king's problem. The sacred space meant nothing to them in that moment, except as the setting for necessary work. They called for Thomas, their voices echoing off stone made for prayers, not threats. What followed was brief, brutal, and eternally consequential. Thomas came forward to meet them, refusing his monks' attempts to hide him. There were more words, demands for submission, refusals to submit. The same script they'd been reading for 6 years, compressed into final moments. The knights grabbed at Thomas, trying to drag him from the cathedral. He resisted with surprising strength for an ascetic. Then the swords came out, and words became irrelevant. The first blow struck Thomas's head, cutting deep but not fatally. He fell to his knees, and in that moment probably realized that his long argument with Henry was about to end in the most decisive way possible. The second blow followed, then the third. The fourth was delivered with such force that it broke the sword on the cathedral floor. Edward Grimm, the visiting clerk who tried to protect Thomas and got his arm nearly severed for his trouble, later described the scene with the vivid detail of trauma. The archbishop's blood mixed with his brains on the stone floor. The knights, their work complete, left as purposefully as they'd arrived. The monks, frozen by shock, took moments to comprehend that their archbishop was dead. The immediate aftermath was chaos compressed into silence. The monks gathered around Thomas's body, unsure whether to treat it as a crime scene or a holy relic. Blood pooled on the cathedral stones, already taking on the significance it would carry for centuries. The great church, violated by violence, seemed to hold its breath. The knights, their mission accomplished, left Canterbury with the same directness they'd shown in arriving. There was no celebration, no immediate guilt, just the satisfaction of men who'd completed a difficult task. They probably believed Henry would reward them once he got over the shock. They had solved his Becket problem with the kind of direct action that medieval politics occasionally required. But even as they rode away, the transformation was beginning. Thomas Becket, the difficult archbishop, the troublesome priest, the man who'd chosen principle over friendship, was becoming St. Thomas, martyr for church freedom. His blood on the cathedral floor was already being collected by the faithful. His last words were being refined into something suitable for hagiography. The news spread with the speed that only catastrophe achieves. Messengers rode through the December night, carrying word that would transform everything. The Archbishop of Canterbury was dead, murdered in his own cathedral by knights claiming royal authority. It was the kind of event that redefined relationships between church and crown, between earthly and spiritual power. Somewhere on the French coast, a ship prepared for crossing. It would carry the news to Henry, who would receive it with shock that seemed genuine whether it was or not. The king, who'd asked whether anyone would rid him of his turbulent priest, was about to discover that some questions should remain rhetorical. The cathedral fell into strange quiet after the knight's departure. The monks performed the necessary rituals, preparing their archbishop's body while trying to process what had happened. They were witnesses to history, though they probably would have preferred to witness something less violent. The stones that had echoed with Thomas's defiant words now held only silence and blood. As night fell on December 29, 1170, Thomas Becket lay dead in Canterbury Cathedral. The long argument was over, ended not by compromise or capitulation, but by steel. The troublesome priest would trouble Henry no more, at least not in life. In death, he would prove even more troublesome, but that transformation was just beginning. The four knights rode through winter darkness, perhaps beginning to understand that they had done something irrevocable. They had solved an immediate problem by creating an eternal one. Thomas Becket dead would be more powerful than Thomas Becket living had ever been. But that understanding would come later, with consequences and condemnation. For now there was only the silence that follows violence, the peculiar quiet that descends when something momentous has happened, and no one quite knows what to do next. The ship on the French coast waited for wind and tide. The swords that had ended an archbishop's life were already being cleaned, and in Canterbury Cathedral, blood soaked into stone that would be worn smooth by the knees of pilgrims not yet born. The exile in the shadows had ended in the darkest way possible. Thomas Becket, who had spent 6 years in French monasteries writing letters and nursing grievances, had returned to England to die. The shadows he'd cast in exile were nothing compared to the shadow his death would throw across centuries. Sleep had come to Thomas Becket at last, the permanent kind that required no hair shirt, no cold stone floor, no careful calculation of suffering. He had been many things in life: merchant's son, able clerk, magnificent chancellor, defiant archbishop, stubborn exile. In death he would be simplified into something more useful, the martyr who stood against royal power and paid the ultimate price. The December night deepened, cold and quiet. In Canterbury Cathedral, monks kept vigil over their murdered archbishop. Across the Channel, a king waited unknowingly for news that would haunt the rest of his reign. And somewhere between, on winter seas, consequences gathered like storm clouds. Good night, Thomas. Your exile is over, your shadows dispersed, your argument concluded in the most final way possible. Sleep well in your stone bed, while the world prepares to make you immortal. The sword has done its work. Now begins the longer work of turning a difficult man into a useful saint, a political murder into a spiritual triumph. The story ends where it began, with silence and shadows and the peculiar peace that comes when all struggles cease. But this is not truly an ending, merely a transformation. The troublesome priest is gone, the eternal martyr is about to be born, and Henry II is about to learn that some problems can't be solved with swords, some questions shouldn't be asked, and some friends once lost haunt you forever. Sleep well. Thank you for listening one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.